Thank you. Okay. All right, well, we're going to continue in Hosea, which we have kind of missed for a couple of weeks, and we've missed it because last time we were together, we did a special installment in the series, and then the week last week we were off because of the weather. We're very grateful now that it's 64 degrees out and sunny, and that we can wear flip-flops and open-toed shoes again in Jesus' name, because us Southerners are just not made for that weather. And I sang that as a Northerner originally who has no desire to ever see snow ever again. And so all these people who are playing for a blizzard, go to Dairy Queen. Amen. You can have any kind of blizzard you want. It will have candy, and it will be cold, and it can just satisfy all those blizzard needs. Amen. Amen. So, everybody stop praying for snow. Everybody stop praying for winter weather. Everybody stop praying for all that nonsense. Okay. We had enough. We have been talking about Hosea because it's a really interesting study for us, because it reveals to us a lot about our relationship with God and our relationship with others. I watched Temptation by Tyler Perry last night, and at first I thought it was kind of like a Hosea story, because in a sense it kind of was. But it didn't have the ending that we often assign to Hosea. And the reason I am saying that is because I have often said that we don't know how the story between Hosea and Gomer ends. We all assume that at the end of the book of Hosea it says, and they all lived happily ever after, the end, and it doesn't. We don't know that they wound up together long term. The type was over. We don't know that they lived happily ever after. We don't know that they didn't continue to have the same problems that they had. And in that movie, in the end, without ruining the whole story for everybody who hasn't seen it yet, because I do think it's a good watch, the movie is interesting because it shows the temptations that people deal with. That they can be as Christian and as wonderful and as pious and as upstanding and as holy as can possibly be, and when something comes along that shows them that they're missing something in their life, whether it's excitement, whether it's intrigue, whether it's better clothes, whatever it is, usually it's associated with some kind of a lifestyle, people get easily swayed. And there's a line in the movie that they said that I thought was really, really poignant. I think that Renee Taylor's character says it, where, oh no, it wasn't Renee Taylor, I think it was Brandy, where she says that, you know, most people are happy until somebody shows them that they're not. And I thought that that was a very poignant story. And Hosea is a good illustration of that concept, because Israel was always fine until somebody showed them that they weren't. And all of us in church are always, it seems like a lot of the time, going through things, and we get the message in church that if you're a Christian, you shouldn't go through anything. You should have the life of Riley, and you should be prosperous, and you should have piles of money everywhere, and you shouldn't ever go through anything. And that is not necessarily what God promises us in the Christian life, but He does promise us that He will take us through what we go through, and that He will show us what we have to do in those situations in order to kind of work them out. And that really is what Hosea shows us, because Hosea went through. Hosea dealt with somebody who was unfaithful, but at the same time, she also went through. We don't talk a lot about her. If you read the Bible, or if you read, I think I've only seen one person ever really focus in on Gomer, and that was T.D. Jakes through Woman Thou Art Loosed. And I don't necessarily know that I agree with the angle that he came from. I don't really think it was bad. Do you remember it? Vaguely. She was the housewife, and she was standing there stirring the stuff, and she's looking out the window, and she's wondering what she's missing, or she's wondering what's out there. I don't know that I necessarily agree with the way that he always portrayed her, because I don't think she ever got that domestic. I don't think that she was somebody who would have ever got that stereotypically wife-like. I think that she was always, the whole point was that she wasn't, and that he was to bring her unto himself. But what happened with Gomer, that Gomer went through too, and that Gomer went through because she didn't obey. Hosea went through because he did. And so what we can kind of see in that, you know, that there's somebody watching this going, well, if I'm going to go through either way, then why shouldn't I just have a good time? Or why shouldn't I just do this? Or why shouldn't I do that? Because Hosea's obedience taught something bigger, and it had a balance to it, and it had an end. Gomer just kept going through and going through and going through and coming up empty. And so what we need to know as believers, or what we need to hold on to, is that when we hear Hosea calling us, when we hear God calling us, when we hear whoever it is calling us, God calling us in our lives, we need to answer that so that we can walk out of where we are. And we need to do that so that we can walk out and come to a better thing. Because just like in the movie, and you know, just like this type here, Israel was just fine until they realized they had neighbors, and their neighbors had more fun than they did, or they had better sacrifices than they did, or they got to, you know, have more money than they did, or they didn't seem to have any problems. But very quickly that all changed. That quickly turned around for Israel, and it quickly turned around for the other nations, because there were all kinds of wars and battles and stuff. And so we've looked at this, we've looked at how hard it was to be what God asked Hosea to be. It was also difficult for Gomer to be what she was supposed to be in that type. She was specifically sought out because she was disobedient, because she was prostituting herself. And so we often talk about all these different things. We had talked about it after service one week, what we do to these people in the Bible. And I remember it was Pastor Veronica that pointed out that, you know, we often just say, oh, well, you know, he was ugly, or he was this, or he couldn't do any better than her, or that. But the Bible doesn't indicate that. The Bible is trying to show us that beautiful things can come out of very difficult situations. And that salvation, which when we talk about salvation, and if you read about it in the Bible, salvation was certainly not ever taught to just be about death, or about life after death, or about not going to hell, which tends to be the context today. They talked about salvation in every context, about being rescued from your enemies, about being drawn up from the pit, about when we got in difficult circumstances, calling upon the salvation of the Lord, because it indicated a redemption, it indicated an ability to come out of something. And so what we're going with here, and what we're talking about here, is that we don't really want to often think about the types that we have to live through, or that the kingdom would ask some of this stuff of us. But when we're in these circumstances, we are called to look to the salvation of the Lord. And we are called to draw upon all of those different things, because all of us live some kind of a type. And I'm going to tell you what, the prosperity type that we see is not the average type that people live in church. And we talked about it earlier, where I was talking about prophets, and I was talking about how, I mean, all these people who say they're called to the family, or they're called to the restoration of the family, or prophesy the family, and they're not willing to do nothing. Now, if you're really called to the family and you're dealing with the things that the family is dealing with, then we should be seeing more people that look like Hosea today. We should be seeing more people that are in relationships and that are in circumstances that are being drawn out of it. We should see more Gomers being called out of things and being brought into a new place. And if people are unwilling to do that, and they call themselves prophets, or they call themselves any of the mess that they call themselves today, then that tells me a lot about what they think being called means. And they don't understand it, and they don't properly understand it. They don't have a clue what all this is about. And so we left off with God's reprimand to unfaithful Israel, who had become idolaters, and they talk about the spirit of adultery, which is idolatry. We had talked about that. And that the sins that we commit are always before God until we repent of them. And so we're going to start in chapter 7 of Hosea. Whenever I would restore the fortunes of my people, whenever I would heal Israel, the sins of Ephraim are exposed and the crimes of Samaria revealed. They practice deceit, thieves break into houses, bandits rob in the streets, but they do not realize that I remember all their evil deeds. Their sins engulf them, they are always before me. They delight the king with their wickedness, the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers, burning like an oven, whose fire the baker need not stir, from the kneading of the dough till it rises. On the day of the festival of our king, the princes become inflamed with wine, and he joins hands with the mockers. They are like an oven, they approach him with intrigue. Their passion smolders all night. In the morning it blazes like a flaming fire. All of them are hot as an oven. They devour their rulers. All their kings fall, and none of them calls on me. So they're going through all of this stuff, and they refuse to call upon God. They refuse to call upon God, even though they're in these situations and they're not turning out right, or they're not turning out well, or they're not going the way that they want to. Talking about smoldering fire and intensity and devouring and all that is an imagery of intensity or of passion. You know, a lot of people talk about passion in a romantic context, but passion refers to any intensity. There's a Latin proverb, the lust of power is the strongest of all passions, meaning that whenever we are following after something intensely, it's a passion. It's something really strong. And so they were passionate about sinning against God. They were passionate about not doing the right thing, and they were passionate about not calling on Him. That's a pretty clear picture, because they did not recognize, as we were talking about earlier, their need for the salvation of the Lord. Somebody like Hosea knows that God has to get him out of where he is. And even somebody like Gomer, who might have a circumstance, might have a situation, also knows that there is no hope for her unless God intervenes within her, or somebody comes and gets her, or somebody comes and moves on her behalf. But these people were in a place where they were hardened. Sometimes we talk about being calloused, or being turned to stone, or being messy, or whatever you want to call it. They were the ultimate mess. Messy, messy, messy people. And that none of them were calling upon God because their passion for what they were doing was so intense. Verse 8, Ephraim mixes with the nations. Ephraim is a flat cake not turned over. Foreigners sap his strength, but he does not realize it. His hair is sprinkled with gray, but he does not notice. Israel's arrogance testifies against him, but despite all this, he does not return to the Lord his God or search for him. Ephraim is like a dove, easily deceived and senseless, now calling to Egypt, now turning to Assyria. Wherever they go, I will throw my net over them. I will pull them down like birds of the air. When I hear them flocking together, I will catch them. Oh, there we go. Birds of a feather smell the same.
That's Ricky Ricardo.
That was Ricky Ricardo. I will catch them. Woe to them because they have strayed from me. Destruction to them because they have rebelled against me. I long to redeem them, but they speak lies against me. They do not cry out to me from their hearts, but wail upon their beds. They gather together for grain and new wine, but turn away from me. I train them and strengthen them, but they plot evil against me. They do not turn to the Most High. They are like a faulty bow. Their leaders will fall by the sword because of their insolent, which is a big word for rude words. For this they will be ridiculed in the land of Egypt. So, in other words, there were two types of people in this chapter. There are the knowingly wrong, and there were the Ephraims, who just kind of get really easily ensnared in the wrong thing. But what is the Bible telling us here? It's that they're both wrong. That God holds us accountable for what we do, and we should not be so gullible. Every single one of us has fallen into stuff, and it's not a judgment call against anybody, but it's the reality that getting so easily ensnared in things is something that we also need to discern, and we need to be people who step back and who are eager to pray and who are eager to seek Him about things going on. And I'm also going to say that it is completely possible to be in a circumstance and feel right about it, and then something in it change. And because something in it changes, that changes the perception of it. Because I'm going to tell you something, people change, and people change really quick nowadays. You know, you can have people that are all there, and they're all, yes, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and then the next thing you know, they're not there anymore. Or the next thing you know, they're not interested anymore. That they don't stick with it. You know, you go and you ask, and you say, okay, I need this. Well, what? You know, there's no well to that. Or we've all been there, we all go to church, we're all real good about it, and it's not because of the weather, it's not because of this or that. Somebody starts, well, I'm not coming anymore. And then we go, what? You know, they don't really have a reason. They don't really have a reason, so they start making things up. And we've all been there, and we've all dealt with that, because no matter how much we want to play dumb, God knows what's going on in our circumstances and our situation. So God is giving Israel, once again, yet another shot and yet another chance. And this time He gets more forceful with them. Okay, let us start in chapter 8. Put the trumpet to your lips. Now, we see that imagery a lot in the Bible. The trumpet was done as an announcement. Has anybody seen in Muslim countries where they ring, they do the call to prayer, and somebody typically blows a horn, or they don't do bells, but somebody typically blows something and it calls everybody to prayer, and it's this horrible sounding thing? Well, that's the same type of thing here. They were used to call assemblies, they were used to call people to prayer, they were used to let people know about things, and they were also used to call different days. So like, for example, it talks about blow the trumpet in Zion, for the day of the Lord has come. That's to notify people about it. So it was like an ancient alarm system or an ancient signal or something of that sort. It let people know that they needed to pay attention. An eagle is over the house of the Lord, because the people have broken my covenant and rebelled against my law. Israel cries out to me, "Oh, our God, we acknowledge you. Ephraim's glory will fly away like a bird." No, oh wait, that's the wrong chapter, I'm sorry. I skipped a page here. Okay. But Israel, verse 3, has rejected what is good, and enemy will pursue him. They set up kings without my consent. They chose princes without my approval. So in other words, the authority that they had in Israel had nothing to do with God. And we talked a little bit about that last time we were here with the book that Pastor's working on as relates to women in the Bible, and about Ahab's daughter who sat on the throne. And then we had the whole thing with the kings and with the princes and with the leaders actually had nothing to do with God. God wanted to be the leader of the people himself. They wanted to have what's called a theocracy. And that is not in the Watchtower sense where they use that term and they're saying that that Kingdom Hall is a theocracy. It's not a theocracy. They have a president and all that, so they still have an earthly leader. But when it came to Israel, God wanted to directly rule the people. He didn't want to have a king. He didn't want them to be like everybody else. And so what happened? They looked around and they realized what they didn't have. And so they're sitting there going, "God, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king, we want a king, give us a king, we want to look like everybody else, we want to be like everybody else." And God said, "Fine, have a king." And they got Saul, who was a mess, who was a man who probably should have never been king. He was somebody who was there to teach the Israelites a lesson, but he did not lead like he should. And now by the time we get down to Hosea, they've had a whole bunch of leaders that should not have been king. They have a whole bunch of people leading them into different places, but they set up kings without his consent, meaning that they did it and that they established leaders and that they established authority that was not of God, that was not God's authority, that was not who God wanted, and they were choosing people without his approval. And so that's something that the church needs to step back and think about today, that there are an awful lot of people in the church, there are an awful lot of leaders that are just not of God. I've always said the thirds rule, that we should have about 1/3 of the people who say they're called actually really are. And then when we start to break that down, that means that 2/3 of people saying they're called aren't, and that would be why you walk into entire churches and the whole room is ordained. Or you have churches where they say, "Oh, well, I'm here for leadership," and they have a church full of people. Everybody in that room cannot be called to leadership. And we also have the counterpoint here. It really is okay to not be called to be in leadership. It is really okay to just be you. If you just want to come to the church and you just want to have a good job and you don't want to run any of the church ministries, or you don't want to be a pastor, or you don't think you're an apostle, or you don't think you're anything, that really is okay. But don't take a seat without God's approval or without God's confirmation, because the result is what we have today. And people are very easily swayed. They're very easily sheepified. If they think you're deep, you know, if you think you're deep, if you say stuff that nobody understands, you're going to get people to follow you even though they don't understand a word of it. You know, I'm going to leave this right here, I'm going to do this, and they always say I'm a IMMA, which is not a word. God apparently didn't tell them it's not a word. Well, I'm going to tell you, you've got people near you, and it's vague, leading, deep stuff that make people look around their lives at suspicion with everybody. You know, and then they start thinking that everybody's against them, and then they start revolting, and then they really stop connecting where they need to for their development and for their ministry, because every single one of us needs to be with other people. We need to be with other believers. We don't need to be traditional. We don't need to look like everybody else, but we do need to be in a place where we're not setting up for our own destruction. So it's very important that the people that we are connected to in leadership have God's approval. And what does it mean to have God's approval? Well, I'm going to tell you, I don't know what it always looks like. I'm not going to lie. I don't think, though, that all these people on Preachers of LA have God's approval. And I think that if we take it that literally, that they have money or they have big followings or they have lots of people or everybody shares their YouTubes means that they're approved, we're looking at the wrong things. Verse 5, throw out your calf idol, O Samaria. My anger burns against them. How long will they be incapable of purity? They are far from Israel. This calf a craftsman has made it. It is not God. It will be broken in pieces, the calf of Samaria. Throwing out the calf idol and talking about being incapable of purity doesn't mean that in the context that we talk about today. Everybody talks about purity rings and being teenagers and all that kind of stuff. They're talking about the spiritual principle behind that of not being idolatrous. Samaria was being told to throw out the calf idol because God's anger burned against them. And how long would they be incapable, basically, of worshiping one God? How long were they going to be like the woman in the movie and like Gomer and like all these people who every time anything said boo, everything got more appealing? And I never thought about it until I was reading this now, that, a lot of the problem with idolatry probably did relate to money, because they had all these big gold things and silver things and bronze things, and they would make offerings to them, and they would do all this stuff, and there wasn't this, I'm going to say, almost peasant appeal to it that they had in Israeli worship, because Israeli worship made allowance for not having any money. That's why we make the joke that people come to church and all of a sudden nobody has any money. They could have had money all week to go to the club, and they could have had money all week, but suddenly they get in church and nobody's got any money. That really the system that God set up is for people whether they have a lot or not. And these pagan systems were very elaborate. They had a lot of the appeal that I think people are looking for in church today. And so instead of bringing literal calves into the church, we're bringing in robes that cost $1,000 a stretch. Or we're doing these big elaborate ceremonies. Or I've been in churches where they have actual replicas of the temple made, like Ark of the Covenant, and they're not cheap. I mean, look them up sometime. They are not cheap, but this idolatrous feel. It wasn't so much the gods as what it represented and what was in their hearts, what was in Israel's heart, like what was in Gomer's heart when she would go off and she would stray. What was within them is what they were seeking after, and the religion was just a means to do it. Religion, beliefs, things like that are the means by which people try to achieve what they want. And it's not any different than it was in the pagan world. They're trying to manipulate it through the spiritual world. And that's why it's so essential that we have a pure worship, that we have a pure system. I mean, I've even thought about, I've seen some of the fountains with the woman at the well and pouring Jesus' feet. I went to church, had a beautiful fountain in the doorway, and I always wanted one of those. And then one day I stepped back and said, well, technically that's an idol. That's technically bringing an idol into the church. Why do we need to have that in church? And people say, well, what about pictures or all that? Well, I don't think that having a saying on the wall is an idol. I think that we can go too far with some of our stuff. I think that we can get really extreme. However, I think that we need to have the eagerness for pure worship rather than just trying to outdo and combat each other and make problems for things where they don't exist. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to outdo each other through our spiritual stuff. I'm going to be better than you. I'm going to do it better than you. You want a picture. Well, I don't need a picture. I don't need this. I don't need that. And we are far away from purity. We are not purely worshiping God, because through our worship of God, we're worshiping ourselves. It's like what they dealt with in Haggai. Verse 7, they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no head. It will produce no flower. Were it to yield grain, foreigners would swallow it up. So that's about futility. That they're trying to do all this stuff, so they're going to sow to the wind. Now let's think about how ridiculous that is. All right, you're sowing to the wind. That means you take something like, let's say that this is a seed. You take the seed and you do this in the wind. And you just throw it in the wind. Contrary to Bob Dylan, the answer is not blowing in the wind. That was who sang that, right? Yeah. they just take it and they throw it to the wind, but then it said what they did yet is they reaped the whirlwind, and so they threw it to nothing, and then they got back double nothing. They got back something with a greater fervor or a greater intensity. The stalk had no head, it would produce no flower, were it to yield grain, the foreigners would swallow it up. So it had no product, it had no purpose, it had nothing about it that was going to do something. And so as I had said last time we were teaching on Haggai, that no matter what we do, we still reap a harvest. It could just be good or it could be bad. And if a farmer has a bad crop, he's still got a harvest. It's not a fun harvest, it's not the harvest he hoped for or worked for, but it's still a harvest. And so if he has a blight or a bad year, that's his harvest. And so it's the same principle here. All of us are going to reap what we sow, basically. And if we sow to the wind, we're going to get back the wind. If we sow in the ground, if we sow in good soil, we're going to get that back. And so we have to be very careful how we sow. And sowing applies in more than one way in our lives. We talk about it in church, and yes, we do need to sow in church. But there are also ways where all of us can sow in our own lives, and things that we can sow in our businesses, and that God talks about that. You know, I've often said that He gives us all the ability to do things. We should have so many more businesses, and if we're always sowing corporately, we're going to keep reaping the whirlwind. We're going to keep throwing it in, and they're going to keep wanting us to work more hours and not pay us more money. And I mean, I can testify to that on my mom's old job, that they had people that were taking work home 9 o'clock at night. They wanted you to be that devoted and that dedicated to the job, and then we found out that they fired all those people. So that's sowing to the wind and reaping the whirlwind, because they wanted ultimate, absolute devotion, but they didn't want to give you any more money. And you know, it wasn't a volunteer position. It wasn't a cause job. It wasn't a job anybody cared about. It was a job, but they're not sowing to themselves in fertile soil, I guess is how we would put that. They're not sowing to God. They're not putting things first. They're sowing like this, like this, like this, and they're investing a lot of time and a lot of effort, and then they wonder where it went. And so there are a lot of ways that we can all sow. There are a lot of ways that God would have us to make it so that we're not just sowing aimlessly and empty. Verse 8, Israel is swallowed up. Now she is among the nations like a worthless thing. For they have gone up to Assyria like a wild donkey wandering alone. Ephraim has sold herself to lovers, although they have sold themselves among the nations. I will now gather them together. They will begin to waste away under the oppression of a mighty king. Though Ephraim built many altars for sin offerings, these have become altars for sinning. I wrote for them the many things of my law, but they regarded them as something alien. They offer sacrifices given to me, and they eat the meat, but the Lord is not pleased with them. Now He will remember their wickedness and punish their sins. They will return to Egypt. Israel has forgotten his Maker and built palaces. Judah has fortified many towns. But I will send fire upon their cities that will consume their fortresses. So Israel was useless. In this kind of a state, that's a useless state. They didn't serve any purpose. They weren't doing anything. And it manifested in oppression. And so, in other words, they were going to be attacked. And what we're going to step back and we're going to think about now is the church today. The church today is always saying that they're being attacked. I don't really think that the church is being attacked. I don't think we know what attack is a lot of times. I think as people we go through personal attacks. I think that when we're dealing with stuff, when we're thinking that things are going better or we're moving in a better place, and then you suddenly go to start the car and the car will not start and there doesn't seem to be any explanation, that you're being attacked. I think that sometimes when we get bills or when people screw with our water or our electricity and they don't have the right to, that we're being attacked. I think that when we go to open up the car door when it worked fine that morning and then the car door won't close, that's being attacked. Or that our printer suddenly just dies out of the blue, that's being attacked. There are lots of really good examples of being attacked. I don't think the church as a whole, though, really understands what it is. It's not being attacked, being taken to court and being told you have to be a decent human being. That's not an attack. That's not a spiritual attack. That's being immature. That's not understanding your role in the world. Or that, people go, oh, well, there should be prayer in schools. Well, nobody took prayer out of your house and y'all don't do it there. So you're not being attacked. You're not being attacked. Your values are not being attacked. Your beliefs are not being attacked. We live in a secular society, in a secular world. Just like the Israelites, just like the first century, and just like them, we don't tend to do any better than they do it. When I turn on the internet and I see stories about pastors who are tattooing people on the altar during service in order to get people to come, and I am not kidding, laid out here with the tattoo artist and the preachers up here in the pulpit, that's not being persecuted, that's not being attacked, that's being stupid. And anybody who goes to that Ephraim, they're being gullible, and that's not any better, as we learned today. But what we are finding and what we are seeing here is that when we become in a state like this, as a church, as a people, we become useless. And that means that we're ineffective. They were supposed to be more or less, we could say, kind of witnessing to the nations around them. They were supposed to be showing them how good God was. And all the time, instead of showing that, they were showing them that God was ineffective, or that God was staunch, or that God wasn't any fun, or that God was difficult, or that God didn't take care of them. And doesn't that sound like people that we know in church today? That, oh, it's just a drag, oh, it's just this, so God doesn't want us to have any fun, God doesn't want us to like things, God doesn't want us to enjoy anything. But when we break it down, we're not doing any better than this. And so, if the church doesn't start to turn around, then the church is going to deal with real oppression. And is really going to come to a place where God's hand that rests upon us is not going to be so eager to shield us and protect us anymore. Because we're going to go through, we could say, the Gomer portion of the experience. And God, being God, will still call to us. He will still want us back. He will still echo to us. But we will be people who go through that experience, that no matter how much we keep selling ourselves and compromising ourselves, and no matter what we do, that we will have the recompense for the sin and for the lack of representation that we have in the world.